Commander Vex'talon of the Galactic Coalition forces had seen just about everything in his 17 cycles of military service. Born with the characteristic blue scales and 4 eyes of the Draxian species, he prided himself on maintaining the composed demeanor expected of his kind. He'd commanded mixed species battalions across 3 galactic quadrants, faced down the notorious Hive Collective, and once survived 2 weeks stranded on the methane lakes of Titan with nothing but emergency rations and a faulty translator. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for working with human medics. Status report, Vex'talon demanded, his secondary eyelids blinking rapidly as he surveyed the makeshift field hospital on Nexus 9. The Coalition's latest battlefield was a miserable, muddy hellscape with 3 suns that somehow still managed to remain perpetually dim and dreary. "Triage is at 76% capacity, Commander," replied Medical Officer Pleat, her translucent tentacles fluttering nervously. The Aquarian's skin shifted from its normal teal to a worried purple. "We've got 27 wounded from the Eastern Front, mostly plasma burns and concussive injuries." Vex'talon nodded, making notes on his holopad. "And the human contingent?" Pleat's color darkened further. "They arrived this morning. 4 of them. They've been settling in." "Settling in how exactly?" Before Pleat could answer, a crash echoed from across the medical tent, followed by raucous laughter that could only come from human vocal cords. Vex'talon's upper eyes twitched. "That would be Chief Medical Officer Murphy and his team," Pleat explained unnecessarily. "Murphy," Vex'talon repeated, the name feeling strange in his mouth despite his translator's best efforts. "Jack Murphy?" "Yes, the one they call Patch for some reason. Their files say they're the best field medics in the Coalition." Vex'talon made his way toward the commotion, his long strides covering the distance quickly. He found 4 humans in standard Coalition medical uniforms, white with blue piping, unpacking crates filled with equipment that definitely wasn't regulation. "Chief Medical Officer Murphy," Vex'talon announced himself formally. One of the humans, stocky, with shortly cropped hair the color of Nexus 9's dirt, and a face full of what Vex'talon had learned were called stubble, turned and flashed a set of blunt white teeth. "Commander, good to meet you. Call me Jack or Patch if you prefer. Nobody calls me Chief Medical Officer except at court-martials, and I've only had 3 of those." He extended a 5-fingered hand, which Vex'talon reluctantly clasped in the human custom. "This is my team," Jack continued, gesturing to the others. "Tina Rodriguez, trauma specialist. Mikhail Petrov, surgical genius, and Rex Howard, pharmaceutical wizard." Each human nodded or waved in turn. The one called Rex, tall and lanky with darker skin, was arranging small glass vials in what appeared to be a modified weapons case. "Those aren't standard Coalition medical supplies," Vex'talon observed, pointing at the case. Jack's face arranged into what the commander recognized as a grin, a human expression that, according to his cultural training, could mean anything from friendly greeting to imminent violence. "Special human supplements," Jack explained breezily. "Nothing to worry about. Just helps us keep up with the pace around here. You know how it is, different species, different needs." Something in the too casual tone made Vex'talon's dorsal scales itch, but before he could inquire further, the perimeter alarm blared. The peaceful introduction to his new medical team would have to wait. "Battle stations," he barked, already moving toward the command center. "Looks like the Hive doesn't care that we're still setting up shop." Jack Murphy just nodded, suddenly all business. "We'll be ready, Commander. Always are." Vex'talon had no idea how true and how terrifying those words would prove to be. The ambush came at the worst possible time, as ambushes tend to do. The Hive Collective had somehow bypassed the eastern perimeter sensors, and now Coalition troops were streaming back to the base with injuries that ranged from definitely survivable to "how is that soldier still conscious?" Vex'talon coordinated the defense from the command center while keeping one eye on the medical channel. The alien medics were performing admirably, but they were quickly becoming overwhelmed. "We need additional support in Medical Bay 3, came Pleat's strained voice over the comm. "Triage can't keep up with her transmission cut off abruptly." "Medical Officer Pleat, report," Vex'talon demanded. When no response came, he made a quick decision. Leaving his second-in-command in charge of defense coordination, he headed toward the medical bays to assess the situation personally. The scene that greeted him was controlled chaos. Wounded soldiers of a dozen different species lay on every available surface. The medical staff moved with urgent precision, but they were clearly losing ground against the tide of injuries. And then Vex'talon saw Jack Murphy. The human was standing in the center of Medical Bay 3, barking orders with unexpected authority. But what caught the commander's attention was what Jack had just done to himself. The human had removed his uniform sleeve and injected something directly into his arm from one of those special supplement vials. The liquid was an alarming shade of green that reminded Vex'talon of radioactive waste. Before Vex'talon could intervene, Jack's pupils dilated dramatically, and he took a deep breath that seemed to physically expand his already substantial frame. "All right, people, let's move," Jack bellowed at a volume that made several nearby sensitive-eared Luriani cover their auditory organs in pain. "Tina, take Bay 4. Rex, I need that trauma kit yesterday. Mikhail, you're with me, we've got 3 Draxians with chest wounds." What happened next defied Vex'talon's considerable military experience. Jack moved with impossible speed between patients, his hands a blur as they stitched wounds, applied regenerative gel, and reset broken appendages. The human was performing the work of 3 medics simultaneously, and doing it better than most. "Scalpel," Jack called out, and the other human, Mikhail, slapped the instrument into his waiting palm without looking, like they'd performed this dance 1,000 times. Vex'talon watched in astonishment as Jack cut into a fellow Draxian's chest cavity with terrifying precision, reached in with his bare hand, and pulled out a fragment of shrapnel that had been inches from the soldier's primary heart. "Pulse is stabilizing," Mikhail reported, checking the monitors. "Next," Jack called, already moving to another patient while stripping off his bloodied gloves. The commander observed for 20 more minutes as the human medical team, led by Jack's frenetic energy, somehow managed to turn the tide of casualties. Patients were stabilized, wounds were treated, and the chaotic triage area slowly transformed into an organized recovery ward. As the crisis abated, Vex'talon saw Jack step behind a privacy screen, hands shaking slightly. Curiosity overriding protocol, the commander moved closer and observed through a gap in the screen as Jack removed another vial, this one containing an amber liquid, and injected it directly into his neck. The human's trembling immediately stopped. Jack rolled his shoulders, cracked his neck in that disturbing way humans often did, and let out a satisfied sigh. "That's more like it," Jack muttered to himself. When he emerged from behind the screen, his pupils had returned to normal size, and his movements were once again those of a standard bipedal mammal rather than the blur of activity Vex'talon had witnessed earlier. "Commander," Jack acknowledged, seemingly unsurprised to find Vex'talon watching him. "Crisis averted. We lost 2, but saved 27. Not bad for an introduction to Nexus 9. "What did you inject yourself with?" Vex'talon asked directly. Jack's face arranged itself into what the commander's cultural training identified as an innocent expression which, paradoxically, usually indicated guilt. "Standard human supplements," Jack replied with a shrug. "Our metabolism works differently than most species. Nothing to worry about." But Vex'talon was definitely worried. No medic, regardless of species, should be able to perform with the speed and precision he'd just witnessed. And he was certain that radioactive-looking green substance wasn't listed in any coalition medical manual. "I'll expect a full inventory of your medical supplies by next cycle," Vex'talon said, trying to sound merely bureaucratic rather than suspicious. "Sure thing, boss," Jack replied with another easy grin. Though I should warn you, human medical terminology can get pretty technical. Might not translate well. As Vex'talon turned to leave, he heard one of the other humans, Rex, whisper to Jack, "Did he see you hit the go juice?" "Doesn't matter," Jack whispered back. "They never understand anyway." And that was the moment Commander Vex'talon decided that understanding was precisely what he intended to do. Commander Vex'talon considered himself a methodical individual. The Draxian Military Academy had instilled in him the virtues of thorough research before action. So rather than confronting Jack Murphy directly, he decided to gather information first. His investigation began with Chief Medical Officer Pleat, who had overseen the integration of numerous species into the Coalition's medical corps. Aquarian physiology responds quite predictably to standard treatments, Pleat explained, her tentacles gesturing expressively. Luriani require special accommodations for their sensitive nervous systems, while Vulcaran muscle tissue regenerates too quickly for conventional sutures. And humans? Vex'talon prompted. Pleat's color shifted to a thoughtful blue-green. Humans are complicated. Complicated how, exactly? Well. Pleat's voice dropped to something like a whisper. They're resilient in ways that defy conventional medical understanding. Their bodies contain numerous redundancies, their pain thresholds are abnormally high. And they produce internal chemicals that other species require medical intervention to replicate, such as adrenaline, cortisol, endorphins. I've studied their medical texts, but much of it seems contradictory. Did you know they intentionally consume substances that damage their organs simply because they enjoy the sensations they produce? Vex'talon blinked, all four eyes in sequence. That can't be right. I assure you, Commander, it is. They call it recreational chemistry. Some human medics have explained it to me as the constant search for the perfect buzz. This was getting him nowhere. Vex'talon decided to try a different approach. Next, he consulted Grax, the Vulcaran weapons specialist who had served with human medics during the Rigelian conflict. Oh yeah, they're nuts, Grax rumbled, his stone-like exterior grinding slightly as he shrugged massive shoulders. Saw a human medic once who got shot, actually shot, and just yanked the bullet out, poured some brown liquid from his canteen onto the wound, then went right back to treating patients. The brown liquid was medicine, Vex'talon asked. Said it was something called whiskey, but claimed it was both disinfectant and painkiller. Also said it was his lunch. This wasn't reassuring. Vex'talon's next step was to examine Jack Murphy's service record. It was impressively long for such a short-lived species, with commendations from a dozen different commanding officers. But there were also scattered incidents that had been officially classified, 3 disciplinary hearings, 2 formal investigations, and 1 event labeled simply as the Cordyceps incident, which was redacted so thoroughly that even Vex'talon's commander access couldn't reveal details. Growing increasingly concerned, Vex'talon decided on a direct approach. He ordered a surprise inspection of the human medical team's quarters. "Contraband check, people," he announced, bursting into their shared barracks with 2 security officers. He was met with 4 remarkably unperturbed humans. Jack Murphy was lying on his bunk, tossing a small ball against the ceiling and catching it repeatedly. "Commander," Jack acknowledged without sitting up. "Looking for something." "Standard inspection," Vex'talon lied. "Medical supplies should be stored in the medical bay, not personal quarters." "Of course," Jack agreed, finally sitting up. "Feel free to look around. We're all regulation here." The search was disappointingly fruitless. Unlike the chaotic medical bay, the humans' personal quarters were immaculately organized. The security officers found nothing beyond standard-issue toiletries and a few items labeled as candy and protein bars. As Vex'talon was preparing to leave, frustrated by the lack of evidence, a coalition-wide alert sounded. A high-ranking medical officer was making an unscheduled visit to evaluate the Nexus 9 operation. 2 hours later, Vex'talon found himself welcoming Medical Officer Drixla, a saurian whose elongated snout and scaled skin made her look somewhat like a distant evolutionary cousin to the commander's own species. "Commander Vex'talon," she greeted formally. "I understand you've recently integrated human medical personnel into your operation." "Correct," he confirmed. "May I ask the purpose of your visit?" Drixla's reptilian eyes narrowed slightly. "Let's speak privately." Once secluded in his office, Drixla's formal demeanor dropped away. "You've been asking questions about human medical practices." This wasn't a question, and Vex'talon felt his scales tighten defensively. "As is my right as their commanding officer." Of course, Drixla agreed too quickly. "But I'm here to save you some time and potential diplomatic complications." Meaning that the Coalition High Command has a standing policy regarding human medical procedures. We don't interfere as long as their outcomes remain positive. Vex'talon's 4 eyes blinked in disbelief. "Even if they're using non-regulation substances?" "Especially then," Drixla said firmly. "The humans joined the coalition with certain conditions. One was medical autonomy. They use techniques that other species find concerning, but their results speak for themselves. I've seen Murphy inject himself with something that looked like toxic waste," Vex'talon protested. "And afterward he moved faster than physically possible." Drixla sighed, a sound that reminded Vex'talon of air escaping from a punctured pressure suit. "Commander, let me be blunt. Whatever you think you saw, whatever you suspect they're doing, just leave it alone. The Coalition Medical Division has spent decades trying to understand human medical and pharmaceutical practices. We've gotten nowhere. But, "Mand." "Listen to me carefully," Drixla interrupted, leaning forward. "There are 3 files in Coalition medical history labeled as the incident where we asked too many questions about human medical practices. Do you know what happened to the commanding officers involved?" Vex'talon shook his head. "Neither do I," Drixla said pointedly, "because those files are sealed by order of the High Command itself. So please, Commander, focus on your military operation and let the humans handle their medical business their way." As Drixla departed, Vex'talon found himself more intrigued than ever. What could possibly be so concerning about human medical practices that the Coalition would rather ignore them entirely than investigate? Unfortunately, he wouldn't have to wait long to find out. "We're overrun," Lieutenant Krex shouted over the comm system. "Eastern perimeter has fallen. Multiple casualties incoming." The Hive Collective had launched their largest offensive yet, flooding the Coalition base with waves of their insectoid soldiers. The attack had been carefully planned. They'd disabled the primary shield generator and damaged most of the automated defense systems before the alarm could even sound. Vex'talon coordinated the defense from the command center, but reports from all sectors were grim. What had begun as a targeted strike was quickly becoming a desperate fight for survival. "Medical bay status?" he demanded into his comm. "Critical," came Pleat's voice, strained beyond recognition. "We've got 67 wounded and counting. Medical Bay 2 has been hit directly. Officer Murphy is attempting to her transmission dissolved into static." "Pleat? Pleat?" Vex'talon shouted. When no response came, Vex'talon made a decision that contradicted every principle of command he'd ever been taught. He left the tactical coordination to his second and headed toward the medical sector himself. The scene that greeted him made the previous incident seem like a routine medical drill. Half of Medical Bay 1 had collapsed, with emergency force fields barely containing the planet's thin atmosphere. Medical Bay 2 was completely gone, a smoking crater in its place. The surviving medical staff had crowded into Medical Bay 3, which was now packed beyond capacity with the wounded and dying. And in the center of it all were the humans. Vex'talon froze in the doorway, unable to process what he was seeing. The human medics had transformed their area into something that looked less like a medical facility and more like an alchemist's laboratory from ancient Draxian mythology. Jack Murphy had set up a makeshift workstation where he was mixing liquids from his special supplements case with Coalition medical supplies, creating concoctions that bubbled and occasionally emitted small puffs of colored smoke. His eyes were unnaturally bright, pupils expanded to nearly eliminate the irises entirely. Nearby, Tina Rodriguez had multiple injectors strapped to her arms like weapons. She moved between patients, administering different colored substances with practiced precision, occasionally pausing to inject something directly into her own thigh without breaking stride. Rex Howard had rigged some kind of distillation apparatus using parts that appeared to have been salvaged from damaged medical equipment. The device was producing a clear liquid that he collected in sterilized surgery trays before adding powders from unlabeled containers. And Mikhail Petrov was perhaps the most alarming of all. The surgeon had removed his regulation uniform top entirely, revealing a body covered in temporary medical tattoos that appeared to be instructions for field procedures. He was performing surgery on 3 patients simultaneously, his movements so precise and rapid that they seemed choreographed. But what truly shocked Vex'talon was the condition of the humans themselves. They were sweating profusely, veins visibly pulsing beneath their skin. Jack's hands should have been shaking from the evident strain, but instead they moved with machine-like steadiness. As Vex'talon watched, Jack reached for a vial containing something black and viscous that resembled no medicine the commander had ever seen. Without hesitation, Jack loaded it into an injector and pressed it against his carotid artery. Vex'talon couldn't stop himself from shouting, "What are you doing?" Jack barely glanced up. "What needs to be done, Commander? We've got 12 critical patients who won't survive the next hour without intervention." He depressed the injector's plunger, and the black substance disappeared into his bloodstream. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Jack's eyes rolled back in his head, his body went rigid, and Vex'talon was certain he was witnessing the death of Chief Medical Officer Murphy. Instead, Jack gasped deeply, his eyes snapped open, and he spoke in a voice that sounded like it was being filtered through gravel. "Tina, bring me the blue vial and prepare for rapid sequence organ stabilization on patients 7 through 15. Rex, I need stimulant batch C17 for the Vulcan warriors. Mikhail, prepare for simultaneous neural pathway reconstruction." The other humans responded instantly, their movements synchronizing with Jack's as if they were extensions of a single organism. A Luriani medic nearby was staring at the humans with an expression of absolute horror. "This violates every principle of medical ethics in the Coalition Code," she whispered to no one in particular. "But is it working?" Vex'talon found himself asking. The Luriani reluctantly checked her diagnostic pad. "Impossibly, yes. Patient survival probability has increased by 37% in the last 9 minutes. But, Commander, they can't possibly sustain this level of..." Her concerns were interrupted as Jack suddenly appeared beside them, moving so quickly that neither had seen him approach. "Commander," Jack acknowledged, his voice still disturbingly altered. "We've stabilized the critical cases, but we need authorization to implement Protocol Black." Protocol Black. Vex'talon had never heard of such a protocol. "Human emergency medical procedure," Jack explained rapidly. "Not technically approved by Coalition standards, but it's our only shot at saving the neural tissue damage cases." Before Vex'talon could respond, a new wave of casualties arrived, soldiers with injuries so severe that several of the alien medics visibly recoiled. No time for debate, Jack decided, already turning away. "Protocol Black it is. Rex. The black case. Now." Rex produced what looked like a weapons case with biohazard warnings plastered across its surface. He unlocked it using a retinal scan and revealed contents that made even Mikhail pause momentarily. "Are you sure, Jack?" Mikhail asked. the first hint of hesitation Vex'talon had seen from any of the humans. "That's our emergency stash. Nothing left after this." "Do it," Jack ordered. What followed was a medical procedure unlike anything documented in Coalition records. The humans moved with perfect coordination, administering substances to the wounded that caused immediate, visible changes, skin tightening over wounds, bones visibly realigning. Even a Vulcan soldier whose severed arm began to reattach itself through some impossible biological process. Throughout it all, the humans continued to inject themselves with various substances. Tina's skin had taken on a slight bluish tinge. Rex was sweating what appeared to be an oily rainbow-colored liquid. Mikhail's pupils had contracted to pinpoints despite the dim emergency lighting. And Jack had become something that seemed barely human at all. His movements were too fast to track properly. He spoke in rapid-fire medical terminology that the translator couldn't keep up with. At one point, Vex'talon was certain he saw Jack's hand pass directly through a patient's chest cavity without making an incision, though that had to be a trick of the emergency lighting. When the crisis finally abated hours later, the results were undeniable. Of the 123 critically wounded soldiers brought to Medical Bay 3, 119 were stable. It was a survival rate that defied not just Coalition medical standards, but the basic laws of biology as understood by most member species. As the last patient was stabilized, Vex'talon watched the human medics gather in a tight circle. They each injected themselves with one final substance, this one clear and unremarkable looking, and within moments, their bizarre physiological symptoms began to recede. Jack's eyes gradually returned to normal, his breathing slowed, and his movements became those of a standard exhausted medical officer rather than whatever he had temporarily become. Catching Vex'talon's stare, Jack gave a weak smile and a thumbs-up gesture before collapsing into a nearby chair. "We need to talk," Vex'talon said. Jack nodded wearily. "Yeah, figured we would eventually. Just let me sleep for about 16 hours first, okay?" For once, Vex'talon found himself in complete agreement with his human medic. Exactly 16 hours later, Commander Vex'talon sat across from Jack Murphy in what remained of his office. The human looked remarkably recovered, considering what Vex'talon had witnessed. Only the dark circles under his eyes gave any indication of the previous day's events. "I believe you owe me an explanation," Vex'talon began, all four eyes fixed intently on Jack's face. Jack took a deep breath. "Look, Commander, there's a reason Coalition High Command has that whole don't ask, don't tell policy about human medical practices. Which is, we're absolutely nuts," Jack said matter-of-factly, "by the standards of basically every other sentient species." Vex'talon's primary eyes blinked slowly. "Elaborate." Jack leaned forward, surprisingly earnest. "So here's the thing about human medical history. It's basically thousands of years of us just trying random stuff to see what works. Our earliest medicines were plants we ate because we saw animals eating them. We performed brain surgery before we invented writing. We treated syphilis with mercury, tried to balance non-existent humors, and at one point believed that blowing tobacco smoke into a drowning person's rectum was proper emergency response." Vex'talon's translator glitched momentarily on that last part. "I'm sorry, you did what?" "Not the point," Jack waved dismissively. "The point is, humans developed medicine through trial and error on ourselves. And along the way, we discovered something important: our bodies can handle an absolutely ridiculous amount of chemical interference." Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out a small container. "This is what we call caffeine. Most humans consume it daily, multiple times a day. For most Coalition species, it's a dangerous cardiac stimulant that would require emergency intervention." "And the green substance I saw you inject?" "Enhanced adrenaline cocktail with metabolic accelerators," Jack said casually, as if discussing the weather. "Speeds up our reaction time, increases strength temporarily, and helps us focus. Side effects include potential cardiac damage, hallucinations, and the occasional nosebleed, but nothing we can't handle. The black substance during the crisis? Jack winced slightly. That one's still experimental. We call it Lazarus juice, military designation XR27. It's basically a synthetic version of the chemical cocktail our bodies produce during life-threatening situations, but amplified about 1,000 times. Technically, it kills us for about 1.5 seconds before jump-starting all systems into hyperdrive. Vex'talon's scales rippled in alarm. You temporarily died? Only mostly, Jack shrugged. It's fine. We've tested it extensively. Well, extensively might be an exaggeration. We've used it 6 times and only one guy stayed dead, but he had a pre-existing condition. This is insane? Jack offered helpfully. Yeah, by your standards, definitely. But here's the thing, Commander. Human medical history is built on self-experimentation. The first vaccines, surgical techniques, anesthetics, they were all tested by doctors on themselves before they were used on patients. Jack leaned back in his chair. Take Dr. Werner Forsman. Guy wanted to prove you could insert a catheter into the human heart safely. His hospital said no, so he inserted one into his own arm, threaded it up to his heart, walked to the radiology department, and took an X-ray to prove it worked. Won a Nobel Prize eventually. And this is admired behavior among humans? Some of our greatest medical heroes were absolute maniacs by coalition standards, Jack confirmed. So when we joined the coalition and saw your medical protocols with all the safety testing and careful trials, well, we played along, but we kept our own methods too. Jack gestured toward the medical bay visible through the window. Those soldiers are alive because we're willing to do things to ourselves that no sane species would consider. That's why the coalition gives us medical autonomy. They don't want to know how the sausage is made, they just want the results. Vex'talon was silent for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, he asked, and the other human medics? They all engage in these practices. Some more than others, Jack admitted. Tina specializes in neurochemical enhancers, that's why she can diagnose neural injuries so quickly. Rex is our pharmaceutical genius. He can synthesize most emergency drugs from basic chemicals found in standard coalition supplies. And Mikhail. Jack paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Mikhail has certain genetic modifications that aren't technically legal in coalition space. Genetic modifications? Vex'talon repeated faintly. Nothing dramatic, Jack assured him unconvincingly. Just enhanced tactile sensitivity in his fingertips, improved visual acuity, and 4 additional pain receptors that can be voluntarily activated to increase focus during complex procedures. Vex'talon stared at Jack for several seconds, then finally asked the question that had been bothering him since the crisis. The Luriani medic said your methods violated coalition medical ethics. If that's true, why does High Command allow it? Jack's expression sobered. Because we get results. Coalition medical protocols are designed for the average of all member species. But in crisis situations, average isn't good enough. You need the crazy species who evolved on a death world and spent their entire history finding ways to cheat death through sheer stubborn insanity. Jack leaned forward again, suddenly intense. Commander, do you know why humans were invited to join the coalition despite being comparatively primitive technologically? It wasn't our charming personalities or cultural contributions. It was our medical corps. In the Battle of Arcturus, a single human MASH unit saved over 2,000 coalition soldiers using techniques that made senior medical officers physically ill to witness. But they couldn't argue with the 96% survival rate. Vex'talon found himself at a rare loss for words. Finally he managed, so what you're saying is... What I'm saying. Then... Jack finished for him. is that there's a very good reason why field commanders don't ask what human medics are injecting themselves with. Because once you know, you can't unknow. And then you have to decide whether you're comfortable having lunatics running your medical bay, or whether you'd prefer a properly regulated medical team with twice the casualty rate. Jack stood up, stretching casually. So, Commander Vex'talon, what's it going to be? Do you want to file a formal complaint about non-regulation medical procedures, or do you want to follow Coalition High Command's lead and implement the time-honored tradition of strategic ignorance? One standard month after what was now being called the Nexus 9 incident, Commander Vex'talon sat in his newly reconstructed office, reviewing reports. The Coalition had successfully repelled the Hive Collective's offensive, and Nexus 9 was firmly under Coalition control. More impressively, the casualty statistics had drawn attention from High Command. The survival rate for critically wounded soldiers under Vex'talon's command was 37% higher than any other Coalition operation of similar scale and intensity. A message flashed on his terminal, Coalition Directive 937B, updated protocols regarding human medical personnel. Vex'talon opened it with mild curiosity, then found himself reading with increasing amusement. The directive, while couched in bureaucratic language, essentially formalized what Jack Murphy had called strategic ignorance. It established a new policy that could be summarized as, don't ask, don't tell regarding human medical procedures. Key provisions included: commanding officers were no longer required to inventory human medical supplies beyond basic Coalition standards. Human medics were granted procedural autonomy during crisis situations. Non-human medical personnel were encouraged to respect species-specific methodologies. All documentation of human medical practices was to be filed separately, accessible only to other human medical officers. The directive concluded with a recommendation that commanding officers focus on outcomes rather than methodologies when evaluating human medical performance. Vex'talon closed the message just as his office door chimed. "Enter," he called. Jack Murphy stepped in, looking remarkably ordinary in his standard Coalition uniform. No one observing him would suspect this human was capable of the medical miracles or horrors, depending on one's perspective, that Vex'talon had witnessed. "Commander," Jack greeted him. "You wanted to see me?" "Yes," Vex'talon confirmed. "I've received new directives regarding human medical personnel. I wanted to discuss implementation with you personally." Jack's expression remained neutral, but there was a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Of course, Commander. Happy to assist with any new protocols." Vex'talon gestured to the chair across from his desk. "I'd been reflecting on our previous conversation, Murphy, about human medical history and practices." "And?" Jack asked, taking the offered seat. "And I've decided to implement my own policy. When I see you or your team heading toward the medical bay with those cases of yours, I will be looking in the exact opposite direction with all four of my eyes." Jack laughed, a sound Vex'talon had come to recognize as genuine. "Probably for the best, Commander." "However," Vex'talon continued more seriously, "I would appreciate some basic parameters. Are there signs I should watch for that would indicate you've gone too far with your supplements?" Jack considered this for a moment. "Fair question. If any of us start glowing, that's probably bad. If we start speaking in languages we don't know, definitely bad. And if our skin turns purple and we grow additional appendages—" "I assume that's human humor," Vex'talon interrupted dryly. "Mostly," Jack admitted with a grin. "But seriously, we're professionals. We know our limits. The stuff we use looks scary to non-humans, but we've been refining these techniques since before we left our home planet. Trust me, we're more careful than we appear." "That's not particularly reassuring given what I've witnessed," Vex'talon noted, but without real censure. Jack leaned forward. "Commander, I've served under 12 different alien officers. Most of them eventually come to the same conclusion, They don't need to understand our methods, they just need to trust that we're good at what we do. Vex'talon's scales shifted in what Jack had come to recognize as the Draxian equivalent of a thoughtful nod. I believe I've reached that same conclusion. Just try not to die on my watch. The paperwork would be excessive. No promises, but we'll do our best, Jack replied with another grin. After Jack left, Vex'talon opened his personal log to make an entry. Commander's log, galactic date 3472.9. I have implemented Directive 937B regarding human medical personnel. Upon reflection, the integration of humans into coalition forces continues to present unique challenges, but their contributions cannot be denied. As one human philosopher apparently said, "The ends justify the means. While I cannot fully condone their methods, I cannot argue with their results." Personal addendum: I've decided humans are like the Ceruvian fire moss of my homeworld, fundamentally toxic to most life forms, potentially lethal if handled improperly, but capable of saving lives when applied correctly by those who understand its nature. I do not understand humans, but I am learning to appreciate them. 2 days later, Vex'talon was conducting a routine inspection of the medical facilities when he noticed all 4 human medics huddled in a corner of the supply room. They had their case open, the one with the ominous contents, and were examining something inside with intense focus. Following his new policy, Vex'talon deliberately turned and walked in the opposite direction. As he did, he overheard Rex say, "This batch should give us about 6 hours of enhanced performance without the cardiac strain." "Yeah, but what about the potential side effects?" That was Tina's voice. "Last time I tried your experimental mix, I could taste colors for 3 days. "Trust me," Rex assured her. "I've worked out the kinks. And I added a little something extra that should prevent the tooth sweating issue from last time." Tooth sweating? Vex'talon quickened his pace, determined to maintain plausible deniability. From behind him, he heard Jack Murphy call out cheerfully, "Don't worry, Commander. Nothing to see here. Just standard human supplements." Vex'talon raised a hand in acknowledgement without turning around. "Carry on, Medical Officer Murphy. I trust your professional judgment completely." And surprisingly, he found that he actually meant it. As he continued his inspection elsewhere, Vex'talon couldn't help but reflect on how quickly one could adjust to the absurd when the absurd consistently delivered results. Perhaps that was the true lesson of working with humans. The universe was stranger and more adaptable than doctrine suggested. "Commander," a voice called over his comm. "We've got incoming casualties from the northern perimeter. Looks like another Hive probe attack." "Acknowledged," Vex'talon responded calmly. "Alert Medical Bay." "Already done, sir." "The human medics say there was a pause. They say they're juiced and ready. Should I ask what that means?" "Absolutely not, Lieutenant," Vex'talon replied firmly. "That's need-to-know information, and trust me, you don't need to know." As sirens began to wail, Vex'talon caught a glimpse of Jack Murphy and his team rushing toward the medical bay. Each wore an expression of intense focus, and Jack had what appeared to be a fresh injection mark on his neck. For the first time since the humans had arrived, the sight didn't fill Vex'talon with alarm or suspicion. Instead, he felt something unexpected: relief. Because when death came calling on Nexus 9, the humans would meet it with their bizarre concoctions, questionable ethics, and inexplicable results. And somehow, impossibly, they would send it packing. Vex'talon turned away deliberately as Jack pulled out a syringe filled with fluorescent blue liquid. Some things really were better left unobserved. And that, throughout Coalition space, is why field commanders no longer ask what human medics are injecting themselves with.